The hum of voices filled the Harvard lecture theater. Here every student was the best of the best, who had passed through a rigorous selection process and proved their worth. But today there was something unusual. The door opened and a girl entered the auditorium. Her dark skin was a stark contrast to the marble columns of the ancient building. Her black curls fell to her shoulders, and her eyes were confident, despite the whispering in the rows. Professor Jeremy Wilson, a tall man with gray whiskers and a penetrating gaze, stopped at her. A faint grin appeared on his lips. "Well, Miss Dash," he glanced down the list. "Johnson. Now that you've made it to Harvard, let's see what you can do." He turned to the blackboard and drew a complex mathematical equation. The students held their breath. Even for them, this was a serious challenge. "You have 3 minutes." "Surprise me," he said coldly. There was silence in the classroom. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. But no one was prepared for what Melissa would do. Silence settled over the lecture hall. All eyes were on Melissa as she stood there, unmoving, staring at the equation on the board. Professor Jeremy Wilson leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, a smirk barely hidden on his face. 3 minutes, he reminded her, tapping his watch. The students exchanged glances, some suppressing amused grins. Everyone knew Wilson loved humiliating those he deemed unworthy. And this was his moment to remind everyone that not just anyone belonged at Harvard. But Melissa? She didn't even blink. She stepped forward, picked up the chalk, and, with one swift motion, began writing. Not hesitating. Not pausing. Not even thinking twice. The numbers and symbols flowed effortlessly from her hand, as if she wasn't solving but simply transcribing something she already knew by heart. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound in the hall. The smirks disappeared. The amused glances turned into wide-eyed stares. Professor Wilson's expression darkened. He pushed off his desk and stepped closer, eyes narrowing as he followed each movement of her hand. And then, she stopped. Melissa turned to face him, setting the chalk down with a soft click. "Done," she said simply. Wilson's lips pressed into a thin line. He scanned the board, his eyes darting over the numbers, searching, desperate, to find an error. But there was none. Not only was her answer correct, but she had solved the equation in a way that was breathtakingly elegant. A method that cut through the problem like a scalpel, precise and efficient. A method that Wilson himself had never considered. A heavy silence hung in the air. Then, somewhere in the room, someone let out a low whistle. Melissa didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just met Wilson's gaze with steady, unwavering confidence. For the first time in years, Professor Jeremy Wilson had no words. And the lecture hall, once so eager to see her fail, was suddenly seeing her in a whole new light. The lecture hall was buzzing before class had even started. News of yesterday's event had spread like wildfire. Melissa Johnson, the unknown transfer student, had embarrassed Professor Jeremy Wilson in front of an entire room. It was the kind of moment that students whispered about in hallways, the kind of academic upset that Harvard hadn't seen in years. Now, everyone wanted to witness the rematch. The air was electric with anticipation. Some students arrived an hour early, securing front row seats as if they were at a championship fight. Others leaned against the walls, unable to find a seat but unwilling to miss what they knew would be a historic moment. And then, the door opened. Melissa walked in. This time, the reaction was different. No one laughed. No one whispered doubts. Instead, there was an unspoken respect, a cautious awe. They weren't just curious about her anymore. They wanted to see what she would do next. At precisely 10 a.m., Professor Wilson entered the room. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable, his footsteps sharper than usual. He was prepared. Melissa met his gaze. It was subtle, but there was a flicker of something beneath his controlled exterior, something dangerous. He wasn't just here to teach today. He was here to win. "Ladies and gentlemen, Wilson began, his voice smooth but tight. Before we begin, I'd like to present a challenge. A murmur spread through the students. A challenge? Wilson turned to the board and, without another word, began writing. At first, it looked like a normal problem, something difficult but solvable. But as the equations stacked up, as the numbers twisted and tangled, a realization rippled through the audience. This wasn't just hard. This was impossible. Gasps. Whispers. Even the top students in the room recognized it. This was a notorious unsolved problem, a problem so difficult that some of the greatest minds in mathematics had tried and failed to solve it for decades. Melissa's eyes flickered, studying the board. And then, Wilson turned to her. "You seemed quite confident yesterday, Miss Johnson," he said smoothly. "Let's see if you can handle something real." A hush fell over the room. He was setting her up to fail. For a moment, there was silence. Melissa didn't react, not immediately. She stared at the board, her dark eyes scanning the numbers, analyzing, as if she were seeing through the puzzle to its very core. But the rest of the room? They were turning on her. "There's no way she can do this." Wilson setting her up to crash, hard. "She got lucky yesterday. This is different." Some students smirked, waiting for her to choke. Others folded their arms, convinced her first win was a fluke. Wilson knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about proving he was smarter. This was about erasing what happened yesterday. If she failed here, no one would remember her victory. They'd only remember how she collapsed under real pressure. Wilson leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, waiting. "Take your time," he said, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. And then, Melissa moved. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, picked up the chalk, and began writing. Not fumbling. Not stalling. Not second-guessing. The chalk glided across the board, symbols appearing faster than anyone could follow. At first, the students assumed she was bluffing, just throwing numbers around, buying time. But then, something changed. They started recognizing patterns in her work. "Wait a second. That actually makes sense. How is she?" Professor Wilson's smirk faltered. Melissa wasn't guessing. She was cutting through the problem like a scalpel, breaking it apart in ways no one had ever attempted before. She wasn't solving this with brute force. She was seeing something they couldn't. Wilson's breathing had changed. Barely noticeable. But Melissa caught it. She had seen this before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't arrogance. It was fear. He had expected her to crumble under pressure. Instead, she was rewriting the very foundation of the problem. And worse? She was winning. He stepped forward, his pulse quickening, scanning her work for mistakes. There had to be one. There had to be. The minutes stretched on. The students were no longer whispering. No longer smirking. They were watching history being made. Melissa's chalk slowed. She reached the final stretch, her movements measured, each line of work falling into place like the last piece of a perfect puzzle. And then, she stopped. The room held its breath. She turned around, setting the chalk down with a soft click. "Done," she said simply. Professor Wilson stared at the board. And then, in one single, slow moment, his face went pale. Because he knew. He knew. She hadn't just solved the problem. She had obliterated it. The silence was deafening. Wilson's eyes moved desperately over the board. He needed, to find an error. A miscalculation. A skipped step. Something, anything, he could latch onto. But there was nothing. Melissa had solved something that wasn't supposed to be solvable. And she had done it in front of an audience. Someone in the back let out a slow, stunned whistle. Then, the first clap. Another followed. Then another. until the entire room erupted into applause so loud it shook the very walls of the hall. Melissa? She just picked up her bag, calm as ever, and walked back to her seat. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She had nothing to prove. Because the work spoke for itself. And as Professor Wilson stood frozen, staring at his own undeniable defeat, one thought echoed through his mind. Who the hell is she? The silence in the lecture hall felt heavier than the towering bookshelves of Harvard's Grand Library. Melissa stood there, arms relaxed at her sides, her dark eyes unreadable. She wasn't waiting for applause. She wasn't seeking approval. But the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a bomb that had yet to fully detonate. Professor Jeremy Wilson took a slow, deliberate breath. His fingers twitched slightly, but he masked his frustration well. He prided himself on control over his students, control over his lectures, control over the image he had cultivated over years of academia. And yet, in under 3 minutes, a student he had openly doubted had dismantled all of it. A cough broke the silence. Then, a quiet murmur spread through the room. Who is she? Did you see how fast she solved that? Even Wilson looked stunned. I'd never seen that before. Melissa turned away from the board, picked up her notebook, and calmly returned to her seat. Not a word. No arrogance. Just quiet confidence. Wilson straightened his posture. He couldn't let this go unanswered. Beginner's luck, he said, forcing a smirk. Let's see if you can handle something real. The challenge had been issued. Melissa looked up, expression still unreadable. But in the depths of her eyes, a flicker of something sharp and knowing glimmered. This wasn't over. The applause still rang in the lecture hall, loud and overwhelming. But Professor Jeremy Wilson? He stood motionless, staring at the board, at the impossible made real. Melissa Johnson, the student he had tried to humiliate, had done the unthinkable. She had solved the problem that had haunted mathematicians for years. And she had done it effortlessly. The students were still clapping, murmuring, exchanging glances filled with shock and respect. This is insane. Wilson looks like he just saw a ghost. She didn't just beat him. She buried him. Melissa? She was already walking back to her seat, as if she had just completed an ordinary homework assignment. No smirk. No self-satisfaction. Just unshaken confidence. That was what made it worse. Wilson could have handled arrogance. He could have fought back against a student who gloated. But Melissa hadn't even acknowledged his existence. She had looked through him. And that? That cut deeper than any words ever could. Wilson took a slow breath. He had spent years building his reputation, years ensuring that no student ever questioned his authority. And in less than 5 minutes, she had cracked that foundation. But no! Not like this. He turned, forcing himself to mask the unease creeping into his veins. Impressive, he said, voice controlled. But... The room froze. The students' heads snapped toward him, eyes wide. He wasn't going to accept it. He was going to fight back. Melissa turned her head slightly, finally acknowledging him. Wilson took a step forward, pointing toward the board. Mathematics isn't just about solutions, he said smoothly. It's about proving why that solution is the best one. There it was. The last card in his deck. A way to undermine her victory. Melissa didn't move. Didn't blink. I see, she said finally. You're asking for a formal proof. Wilson nodded, folding his arms. Anyone can arrive at an answer. But can you prove it with the rigor that Harvard expects? He smiled, confident in his move. This was his domain. There was no way she could construct a formal proof of such a complex problem in real time. If she hesitated, even for a moment, he could regain control. And yet... Melissa tilted her head slightly. And then, she stood up. All right, she said, stepping forward. Let's prove it. The audience leaned in. This wasn't just a lecture anymore. This was a fight. Melissa picked up the chalk again, but this time, her movements were slower, deliberate. Not rushing. Not performing. Just constructing. Step by step, she laid out the foundational principles that underpinned her solution. First, she broke the equation into its core components, showing why traditional approaches failed. Then, she introduced a novel theorem, one that hadn't been applied to this problem before. Gasps. Wilson's stomach tightened. He recognized what she was doing, but no, that wasn't possible. Because what she was presenting was new. She wasn't just solving the problem. She was creating new mathematics in real time. Wilson's heart pounded in his chest. This isn't happening. But it was. The student sat stunned, watching as Melissa built something no one had ever seen before. She wasn't just proving her answer. She was rewriting the very way people thought about the problem. And by the time she finished, placing the chalk down softly, there was nothing left to argue. Wilson's mind raced. He had to respond. Had to reassert control. If he let this moment pass without challenging her, his entire reputation would collapse. He stepped forward quickly, scanning her proof. His eyes darted through each line, searching, desperate, for a flaw. There had to be one. But the deeper he looked, the more he realized the truth. Her proof was airtight. And the worst part? It was beautiful. Elegant. Flawless. Something that deserved to be in textbooks. Wilson's breath came shaky now. He was losing control of the moment. The room was watching him. Expecting him to admit the truth. Expecting him to do what he had forced students to do for years. But he couldn't. He turned away from the board, facing the class. And in the weakest voice they had ever heard from him, he muttered, "That will be all for today." Silence. Not stunned silence. Not anticipatory silence. But a silence that spoke volumes. Wilson walked out without another word. He didn't dismiss the class. He didn't attempt to reclaim the conversation. He just left. Melissa stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then, as if nothing had happened, she picked up her bag and walked back to her seat. And only then, only after she sat down, did the room erupt. Not with whispers. Not with murmurs. But with cheers. Some students clapped. Some laughed in disbelief. And some just sat there, staring at her like she had just defied the laws of physics. One student leaned over, whispering, "Who the hell are you?" Melissa exhaled softly, shaking her head. "I'm just a student." But deep down, deep in the very core of Harvard's math department, everyone knew the truth. She wasn't just a student. She was a revolution. The next class was packed. Word had spread like wildfire. The new girl had humiliated Wilson. Students who had never once attended a Wilson lecture suddenly found themselves eager to watch the sequel to yesterday's disaster. Melissa entered the room just as casually as before, but now the weight of dozens of curious stares followed her. She ignored them, settling into her seat as if she hadn't become an overnight sensation. Wilson walked in, dressed sharper than usual, a glint of something unreadable in his cold blue eyes. Today, there were no pleasantries. No introduction. Without a word, he turned to the board and began writing. This was war. Melissa watched as he filled the space with a notoriously unsolved problem, something so complex that mathematicians had debated its solution for decades. Gasps rippled through the room. He's setting her up to fail. No one's ever solved that. It's impossible. Wilson stepped aside, arms crossed, his smirk now fully formed. Take your time, Miss Johnson. This time, there was no time limit. But the message was clear: if she couldn't solve this, her previous victory would be dismissed as a fluke. Melissa stared at the board. Then she smiled. And she picked up the chalk. Harvard didn't sleep that night. Melissa Johnson's name was everywhere. The whispers started in the math department, but by the next morning, she was the topic of discussion in law lectures, engineering workshops, even philosophy debates. Did you hear what happened in Wilson's class? The girl solved an unsolvable problem. She humiliated him. In front of everyone. At first, some students dismissed it as exaggeration. Then, they saw the proof. By noon, a group of students from the graduate program had reviewed Melissa's work. Their verdict? It was groundbreaking. And Wilson? He was nowhere to be seen. Wilson didn't show up for his afternoon lecture. He canceled his office hours. The man who once walked through Harvard like he owned it had vanished overnight. But the silence didn't mean surrender. No. Melissa knew men like him didn't admit defeat. They plotted revenge. She had seen it before. She had lived it before. And she wasn't naive enough to think Wilson would let her go unchallenged. But what could he do? She had beaten him fair and square. Or so she thought. The next morning, an email arrived. From Professor Jeremy Wilson. Subject, an invitation to greatness. Melissa clicked. Melissa. I must admit, your performance in my class was impressive. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But the true mark of genius is not a single moment, it is consistency. If you are as brilliant as you seem, prove it again. You are formally invited to compete in the Harvard Mathematics Invitational. A private event exclusive to the top minds in the university. If you win, your place at Harvard will be undisputed. If you lose, well, I suppose we will find out, won't we? Let's see what you're truly made of. Professor J. Wilson. Melissa exhaled slowly. So, this was how he planned to take back control. The Harvard Mathematics Invitational. An elite competition, closed to the public. Judged by hand-picked faculty members, including Wilson himself. If Melissa entered, she'd be going into his arena, where he controlled the rules. It was a setup. A way to put her under pressure, to create a scenario where she couldn't possibly win. And yet, she smiled. Because he had just made a mistake. He had challenged her. And Melissa Johnson never backed down from a challenge. Word spread fast. When students heard that Melissa had been invited to the invitational, a wave of excitement hit the campus. People wanted in. They weren't just rooting for her. They wanted to help. And so, one by one, they started showing up. First, it was Nathan Wu, a senior specializing in abstract algebra. Then came Sophia Reyes, a mathematical physicist with an analytical mind sharper than a scalpel. And finally, David Carter, a programming genius who could see patterns others missed. Each of them had something to offer. Each of them knew what Wilson was trying to do. And none of them were going to let it happen. 3 days before the competition, Melissa received another message. This one wasn't from Wilson. It was anonymous. Stay out of the invitational. You don't belong here. Leave while you still can. Melissa stared at the words. Then, she deleted the email. They were scared of her. That meant she was already winning. The night before the competition, Melissa and her team sat in a quiet study room. Books, papers, and equations covered the table. They ran drills. Reviewed theory. Sharpened their logic. But in the end, it wasn't about preparation. It was about mentality. Nathan leaned back, rubbing his temples. Wilson controls the judges. He controls the format. This is a setup. Sophia crossed her arms. He's going to do everything possible to make sure you fail. David nodded. They'll throw problems at us designed to break us. Melissa listened. She knew they were right. But then she smiled. And when Melissa Johnson smiled, the world should be afraid. Let them try. The next morning, the Harvard Mathematics Invitational began. A grand hall had been prepared. Tables arranged like a battlefield, where only the best of the best were invited. The faculty sat at the judging table, their faces unreadable. And standing at the front, waiting for her, was Wilson. Melissa stepped forward, her team following behind her. The stage was set. The game was beginning. And this time? Wilson wasn't just facing a student. He was facing a revolution. The moment Melissa touched the board, the air changed. The scribbling of her chalk was fast, precise, like an artist painting strokes on a masterpiece only she could see. The audience barely breathed, watching as she weaved through numbers and theorems, connecting concepts others hadn't even considered. Wilson's smirk faltered. This wasn't possible. Melissa wasn't stumped. She wasn't hesitating. She was solving it. He stepped closer, trying to find a flaw in her process. But the deeper she went, the more terrifyingly brilliant her logic became. Then, she stopped. The board was filled with calculations, a maze of symbols that no one but the most advanced mathematicians could fully grasp. Melissa set the chalk down and turned to face the professor. "Your turn," she said, voice steady. A challenge. The grand hall of the Harvard Mathematics Invitational was packed. Rows of elite competitors sat at tables, their sharp gazes scanning the competition. The judging panel, composed of Harvard's most distinguished mathematicians, sat elevated above the stage, whispering among themselves. And in the center of it all, standing like a king surveying his empire, was Professor Jeremy Wilson. Melissa walked in, unshaken, flanked by her team. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes on her. Some curious. Some hostile. Wilson's lips curled into a subtle smirk. "Welcome, competitors," he said smoothly. "Today, we separate the brilliant from the lucky." His gaze flickered to Melissa for the briefest second. She didn't flinch. Because luck had nothing to do with this. Wilson turned to the audience. The Harvard Mathematics Invitational is designed to test not just knowledge, but resilience. This is not a classroom. This is war. Murmurs. Some competitors shifted uncomfortably. Others straightened, eager for battle. Wilson gestured toward the stage, where 3 massive chalkboards stood. "This year's format is unique," he continued, eyes glinting. Melissa knew what that meant. He was changing the rules. "The competition will be divided into 3 rounds," Wilson said. "Each round will eliminate the weakest minds, leaving only the best standing. Round 1, speed and accuracy, a barrage of rapid-fire problems. Round 2, complexity, only the most advanced thinkers would survive. Round 3, the impossible problem, a challenge that had never been solved before." Melissa didn't blink. Wilson was looking right at her. He wanted her to break. Instead, she smiled. "Game on." A loud buzzer rang through the hall. Time to begin. The first round was designed to eliminate the weak. Each competitor was given a tablet, with a stream of rapid-fire problems appearing one after another. No breaks. No second chances. The challenge? Solve as many as possible in 10 minutes. Speed and accuracy. One mistake? You're out. Melissa moved fast. Her fingers flew over the screen, solving, confirming, moving on. Efficient. Calculated. Precise. Around her, competitors began to fall. One by one, screens flashed red, indicating an error. Some groaned in frustration. Some sat back, stunned. Melissa? She wasn't even breathing hard. Her mind worked like a machine, faster, 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 until the buzzer blared again. "Time's up!" The screens froze, and the results appeared. Over half the competitors had been eliminated. And at the very top of the rankings, with a flawless score, Melissa Johnson. Wilson's jaw tightened. The survivors were given a short break. Some students slumped in their chairs, exhausted. Others whispered among themselves, glancing at Melissa. "She's a machine," someone murmured. "No way she keeps this up." Wilson stepped forward. "Congratulations to those who remain," he said, though his voice held no warmth. "But now, we separate the clever from the truly gifted." He gestured to the 3 massive chalkboards on the stage. Round 2. The competitors were called up one by one, each given a problem to solve in front of everyone. The goal? Not just to find an answer, but to prove it beyond a doubt. Melissa was called last. By then, half the competitors had cracked under the pressure. Some got stuck. Some made mistakes. Some were simply too slow. And then, Melissa stood at the board. Wilson crossed his arms. Her problem was brutal. A chaotic mess of abstract algebra, topology, and combinatorics. Wilson had handpicked this one. Designed to make her freeze. But Melissa? She took one look, just one, and smiled. Then she began writing. Fluid. Sharp. Absolute control. Every movement of her hand was effortless, a symphony of logic and creativity. By the time she finished, the audience was silent. Wilson's fingers curled into a fist. Another perfect performance. Another public humiliation. Melissa put the chalk down, turned, and walked back to her seat. She never even looked at him. There were only 5 competitors left. The best of the best. But Wilson wasn't done. The third and final challenge? One problem. A problem so difficult that no known solution existed. Wilson approached the chalkboard slowly, savoring the moment. "This," he said, "is where true genius is revealed." Melissa watched calmly. He picked up the chalk. And wrote. The symbols stretched across the board, twisting into something darkly beautiful. The audience leaned in, breathless. This was it. The ultimate test. Melissa stood. The final battle had begun. The room had never been quieter. Wilson had to respond. He had to find a mistake. If he didn't, then everything, his reputation, his authority, his superiority, would crack. He stepped forward, scanning the board. First once. Then twice. Then a third time. His breath grew sharp. His fingers clenched behind his back. Because it was perfect. Melissa had solved something that had baffled world-class mathematicians. And she had done it in front of an audience. His students were watching him crumble. And then, the final humiliation. A student near the back, one of Wilson's best, a quiet but brilliant mind, slowly raised his hand. "Professor, I think she's right." A ripple of realization spread through the class. Wilson's body stiffened. His knuckles turned white. Melissa tilted her head, watching him with an expression that was almost pitying. "You were right about one thing," she finally said. "Some people don't belong at Harvard." And with that, she picked up her bag and walked out, leaving Wilson standing in front of a room full of witnesses to his greatest defeat. The air in the Harvard Mathematics Invitational changed. The noise. The whispers. The tension. Everything faded into silence as Professor Wilson stood at the chalkboard, his back turned to the audience, carefully crafting the final challenge. Melissa watched. She could feel it, the weight of history pressing down on this moment. This wasn't just an ordinary problem. This was his final move. Wilson's last chance to break her. And then, he stepped back. And the room gasped. Because what he had written on the board wasn't just hard. It was legendary. There were only 5 competitors left. Each of them was a prodigy. Each had survived the brutal first 2 rounds. But now, they faced something never solved before. A problem that had haunted mathematicians for decades. an equation that stood like a monument to the impossible. Wilson turned, his expression controlled, but his eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "You have 1 hour," he announced. His voice was steady, but there was a challenge hidden beneath his words. "Solve this, if you can." Melissa felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. Some competitors hesitated. Some swallowed hard. But she stepped forward without a second thought. Because impossible had never meant anything to her. The timer began. Pen scratched against paper. Chalk met board. Some competitors froze, unable to even begin. Others attacked the equation aggressively, trying to brute force a solution. Melissa? She sat still for the first 5 minutes, her eyes locked onto the problem. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She was seeing. Wilson watched her closely. Something about her stillness unnerved him. He had expected frustration, doubt, hesitation. But instead, she looked amused. And then, she picked up the chalk and started writing. Melissa's approach was unconventional. She ignored traditional methods. She broke the equation apart in a way no one expected. She bypassed the roadblocks mathematicians had stumbled on for years. It was like watching someone cheat the laws of logic. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some of the remaining competitors stopped working, turning to watch her instead. Even the judges leaned forward, eyes wide. And Wilson? He stepped closer, his expression no longer neutral. Because he recognized what she was doing. She had found something. A path through the equation that no one had ever seen before. Wilson's fingers twitched. He clenched his jaw. And then, in front of everyone, he did something unthinkable. He interrupted. "Miss Johnson." The room froze. Melissa paused, chalk in hand. Wilson's voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it. "You seem confident." Melissa turned, tilting her head slightly. "I am." A low murmur spread through the audience. Wilson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Confidence is dangerous," he said softly. "Especially when it leads to assumptions." He pointed to the middle of her proof. "You made a mistake." The crowd gasped. Eyes darted to the board, scanning her work. Had she really messed up? Melissa didn't even blink. Instead, she set the chalk down, stepped back, and looked directly at him. "No, I didn't," she said. Wilson's expression hardened. His trap had failed. Melissa turned back to the board. She continued writing. Wilson had tried to shake her. But now, he was watching his own defeat unfold in real time. Her proof was flawless. Step by step, she constructed the impossible. Wilson's breathing grew sharp. He wanted to stop this. He wanted to undo this moment. But he couldn't. Because Melissa Johnson had done it. With a final stroke of chalk, she boxed her answer. Silence. Then, the judges stood up. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. The judges, some of the most respected minds in the field, examined her work. Carefully. Methodically. Wilson stood stiff, his jaw locked. Minutes passed. And then, the head judge, Dr. Eleanor Harding, turned to Melissa. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the room. "This is correct." The room exploded. Applause. Cheers. Stunned disbelief. Melissa stepped back, arms relaxed, as if she had known this would happen all along. Because she had. She turned to Wilson, watching as he tried to mask the storm brewing inside him. She had just done what he spent his entire career trying to prove was impossible. And she had done it in front of everyone. Wilson had no move left. Checkmate. Wilson stood frozen as the cheers rang around him. For years, he had ruled this competition. For years, he had been untouchable. But now, in the span of a single day, he had been dismantled. Melissa Johnson had arrived at Harvard as an unknown. Now, she owned the moment. Wilson swallowed hard, turning away, walking off the stage before anyone could see the cracks in his composure. Melissa watched him go. And for the first time, she let herself smile. Not out of arrogance. Not out of revenge. But because, for the first time ever, she knew. This was just the beginning. Wilson was gone. Melissa stood at the center of a storm of applause, disbelief, and history in the making. Judges shook their heads, still processing what had just happened. Students whispered, eyes locked on her like she wasn't human. She solved it. No, she destroyed it. Wilson just walked out. Melissa took a breath. The room wasn't just looking at her. They were seeing her. Wilson's era had just ended. And hers had begun. Melissa didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. By the next morning, the university wasn't the same. Professors debated her solution. Mathematicians worldwide studied her work. Her name was everywhere. But the real victory? The email she received that evening. Melissa, you have my attention. Let's talk about your future. MIT Mathematics Department. She smiled. Wilson had spent years defining who belonged at Harvard. Now, Melissa defined herself.